January 17, 1943, Stalingrad, minus 38 degrees Celsius. The frozen breath of a young Panzer grenadier named Franz Becker hangs in the air like a death sentence. His gloved fingers, blackened at the tips, clutch a photograph of his family in Munich. Behind him, the skeletal remains of a Panzer IV tank sits abandoned, its turret blown open like a tin can, frost crystallizing across the jagged metal edges. The machine that once represented German engineering supremacy now serves as a windbreak for dying men. Franz stares at the photograph, then at the tank, then at the gray infinity of the Russian steppe. He whispers a question into the wind that no one answers. How did we lose the tanks? 3,000 kilometers away, in a factory outside Detroit, a different kind of thunder rolls. The sound is not artillery. It is the rhythmic hammer of American industry, a mechanical heartbeat pounding out Sherman tanks at a rate Franz Becker could never comprehend. Every 7 minutes, another Sherman rolls off the assembly line at the Chrysler Tank Arsenal. Every 7 minutes. While Franz freezes in Stalingrad, wondering where German reinforcements have gone, American workers are producing tanks faster than Germany can count its losses. This is not a story about battlefield heroics or strategic brilliance. This is a story about numbers. This is a story about industrial might, so overwhelming that it rewrote the rules of modern warfare. This is the story of how Germany entered the Second World War believing they possessed the finest military machine on earth, only to discover they had brought a knife to a gunfight with a nation that could forge knives by the million. The German High Command never understood America. They couldn't. Understanding America required abandoning everything the German military aristocracy believed about war, about production, about the nature of industrial capacity itself. In the traditional European conception, war was an art practiced by professionals, a chess game played with carefully husbanded resources. Tanks were precision instruments crafted with care, deployed with strategic calculation. The German military mindset, forged in the fires of Prussian tradition and perfected through the rapid victories of 1939 and 1940, saw armored warfare as a scalpel operation, quality over quantity, engineering excellence over mass production. The panzer divisions that smashed through Poland and France were manned by highly trained crews operating what were, at the time, some of the finest tanks in the world. The Panzer III and Panzer IV represented German engineering philosophy, sophisticated, powerful, built to exacting standards in factories where craftsmen took pride in precision. This mindset was not mere arrogance. It was rooted in German industrial reality. Germany in 1939 was a modern industrial nation, certainly, but its manufacturing base was fundamentally different from America's. German factories were smaller, more specialized, less integrated. Tank production was spread across multiple manufacturers, each with their own standards, their own supply chains, their own methods. Daimler-Benz, MAN, Henschel, Krupp. These were not mass production facilities in the American sense. They were engineering houses that built tanks the way one might build locomotives or heavy machinery, carefully, deliberately, with attention to craft. In 1940, Germany produced approximately 2,200 tanks and self-propelled guns. This seemed adequate. The Blitzkrieg had worked. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Britain stood alone, apparently impotent. Why would Germany need more tanks when the ones they had were winning? The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 should have shattered this complacency. Operation Barbarossa committed over 3,600 tanks to the largest invasion in human history. Within 6 months, nearly half of those tanks were destroyed, broken down, or abandoned. The Russian winter, the vast distances, the unexpectedly fierce Soviet resistance, all of these factors took their toll. But the German response was not to radically increase production. In 1941, Germany produced only 3,790 tanks and self-propelled guns. The number increased in 1942 to 6,180 units. These were respectable figures by European standards, but they were inadequate for a multi-front war of attrition, and they were utterly insignificant compared to what was coming from across the Atlantic. American entry into the war in December 1941 was greeted with dismissive contempt by much of the German leadership. Adolf Hitler himself had expressed scorn for American military potential, describing the United States as a mongrel nation weakened by democracy, corrupted by capitalism, incapable of the martial discipline required for modern war. This was not an uncommon view among the German officer corps. America was seen as soft, decadent, a nation of shopkeepers and movie stars who had sat out the first years of the war while real soldiers did the fighting. The American military in 1941 was indeed small by European standards, ranked 18th in the world, behind Romania. American tanks were laughable. The M3 Grant was an awkward, riveted box with a hull-mounted gun and a design that seemed to embody everything Germans found contemptible about American engineering. Where was the sophistication? Where was the elegance? The M4 Sherman, when it appeared, seemed no better. Medium armor, medium gun, nothing exceptional, nothing fearsome. What the Germans failed to grasp was that the Sherman was not designed to be exceptional. It was designed to be producible. It was designed to be everywhere. The American approach to industrial warfare represented a philosophical revolution that German observers simply could not process. America did not see tanks as precision instruments. America saw tanks as commodities, mass-produced commodities that could be manufactured using the same assembly line techniques that had revolutionized automobile production, standardized across manufacturers, designed for rapid production and easy maintenance. The Sherman tank was built to be simple. It used a commercial truck engine, the Wright R975 radial aircraft engine, or the General Motors 6046 diesel, both proven designs that could be produced in enormous quantities. Its transmission was straightforward. Its armor was welded rather than cast in complex shapes, speeding production. Every component was designed with manufacturability in mind. The Sherman was not built to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was built to ensure that there would be 5 Shermans for every German Panther, 10 Shermans for every Tiger. The numbers are difficult to comprehend even now, 8 decades later. In 1942, the first full year of American participation in the war, the United States produced 24,197 tanks. 24,997 tanks. In a single year, Germany, fighting desperately on 2 fronts, produced 6,180. The ratio was 4-1. In 1943, American production exploded to 29,497 tanks. Germany managed 10,700. The ratio was approaching 3-1, but these numbers tell only part of the story because America was simultaneously producing tanks for Britain, for the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, for its own expanding armored divisions. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal alone, a single facility built specifically to manufacture Shermans, produced more tanks than the entire Italian nation managed during the entire war. The transformation of American industry occurred with breathtaking speed. In 1940, America had precisely 2 tank factories. By 1943, there were dozens, employing hundreds of thousands of workers. Ford's River Rouge complex, General Motors' Fisher body plants, Chrysler's new Arsenal of Democracy in Warren, Michigan, these facilities operated around the clock, 3 shifts, 7 days a week. The workforce was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Women comprised 40% of workers in many plants. African Americans found employment in factories that had previously excluded them. The assembly lines moved with mechanical precision, each worker performing a specific task, each component arriving just in time, each tank taking shape with industrial efficiency that seemed almost magical. Franz Becker, freezing in Stalingrad, knew nothing of this. The German soldiers on the Eastern Front in early 1943 were told that new tanks were coming, that production was increasing, that the fatherland's industrial might would soon turn the tide. They believed it because they had to believe it. What else could they do? But the reality was mathematically inescapable. Even as Germany finally began ramping up production, reaching 19,800 tanks in 1944, the peak year, America produced 17,565 Shermans alone that year, plus thousands of tank destroyers, self-propelled guns, and light tanks. And this was in addition to supplying the Soviet Union with over 7,000 tanks through Lend-Lease and producing tens of thousands of aircraft, hundreds of ships, millions of trucks. The psychological impact on German soldiers when they finally encountered American forces in North Africa was profound. The Afrika Korps, battle-hardened veterans of desert warfare, expected to face the same kind of limited, carefully rationed opposition they had encountered from the British. Instead, they found themselves confronting an enemy that seemed to have infinite resources. American supply dumps were staggering in their abundance. German soldiers who captured American positions found warehouses full of equipment, food, ammunition. One captured panzer commander, interrogated after the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, expressed bewilderment at what he had seen. "They waste tanks like we waste bullets," he told his interrogators. He meant it literally. American commanders, knowing that losses could be replaced within weeks, sometimes within days, employed tanks with a profligacy that seemed insane to German tactical doctrine. A Sherman knocked out in the morning might be replaced by 2 Shermans that afternoon. This abundance became a recurring symbol of American power, appearing in German after-action reports, prisoner interrogations, diary entries. The tanks themselves became psychological weapons. German soldiers learned to their horror that destroying American armor was not enough. You could knock out 3 Shermans, 5 Shermans, 10 Shermans, and more would appear. The American military operated on principles of overwhelming material superiority that violated every German assumption about warfare. In traditional military thinking, you husband your armor, protect your tanks, withdraw when losses become unsustainable. American doctrine was different. Press forward, accept losses, replace them, keep pressing. The materiel would always be there because America could always make more. The Italian campaign revealed the full scope of the disparity. After the fall of Sicily in August 1943, German forces retreated up the Italian peninsula, fighting delaying actions with skill and determination. But every engagement cost them tanks they could not easily replace. The Allied forces, by contrast, maintained a steady stream of reinforcements. Tank losses were replaced from depots in North Africa, or directly from American ports, or from British production. The Germans fought brilliantly, utilizing terrain, employing their heavier tanks with tactical acumen, inflicting disproportionate casualties. None of it mattered. The math was inexorable. By late 1943, German panzer crews began reporting a new phenomenon, tank anxiety. Not fear of combat exactly, but a gnawing awareness that every battle would feature more enemy tanks than the last, that the tide of American armor was rising, that German production, even with the increased output of Panthers and Tigers, could never match the flood of Shermans. The German response to American industrial power went through several phases. First came denial. American tanks were inferior, American crews poorly trained, American tactics unimaginative. This was partially true. The Sherman was inferior to the German Panther in a one-on-one engagement. American crews in 1943 were often green, undertrained by German standards, but denial gave way to rationalization. Germany would win through superior tactics and better tanks. The Panther and Tiger programs were expanded. These were formidable machines, no question. The Panther, introduced in 1943, was arguably the best tank of the war, well-armored, mobile, mounting a devastating 75mm high-velocity gun. The Tiger was a monster, nearly impervious from the front, capable of destroying Shermans at ranges where the Sherman's gun was ineffective, but Panthers and Tigers were complex, expensive, time-consuming to build. In 1943, Germany produced 1,668 Panthers and 649 Tigers. That same year, America produced 20,497 tanks, of which approximately 21,000 were Shermans. The mathematics haunted German military planners. In meetings at Wehrmacht headquarters, officers pored over production figures with growing desperation. How could this be possible? How could a nation on the other side of the ocean, a nation that had been at peace until 1941, produce more tanks in a single year than Germany could produce in 3? The answer was uncomfortable. America had fundamentally different economic and industrial systems. American factories were larger, more automated, more efficient. American supply chains were integrated and rationalized. American workers were better fed, better housed, more productive. The American economy was simply bigger, dramatically bigger, than Germany's, and it was entirely dedicated to war production without the burden of strategic bombing that plagued German industry. By 1944, the disparity had become a crisis. The Normandy invasion in June brought the full weight of American industrial power directly to bear on German forces in Western Europe. The breakout from the Normandy hedgerows in late July showcased American doctrine at its most devastating. Operation Cobra employed massed armor in concentrations that German defenders found overwhelming. Individual American tank battalions might be outfought. German panzer crews were still, man for man, among the best trained in the world. But the cumulative effect was crushing. For every German tank destroyed, 2 more American tanks appeared. For every German defensive position reduced, American armor pressed forward to the next objective. The German army in France, despite fighting with skill and desperation, was simply ground down by the sheer weight of materiel. German soldiers captured in France told interrogators variations of the same story. They described endless columns of American vehicles, tank after tank after tank, stretching to the horizon. They described the sound of American industry, the mechanical thunder that never stopped. The sense that they were fighting not an army but a machine, an automated system of war production that simply could not be defeated by courage or tactical skill. One Panzer officer captured in the Falaise pocket in August 1944 sat silent for several minutes when asked about American armor strength, then said simply, "You cannot destroy them all. There are always more, always." The symbolic resonance of the tank in German military consciousness cannot be overstated. The Panzer divisions had been the spearhead of German victory, the technological expression of German superiority, the proof that modern mechanized warfare favored the disciplined and the technically proficient. To have that symbol inverted, to find oneself outnumbered, outproduced, overwhelmed by an enemy whose tanks were individually inferior, but collectively unstoppable, this was a psychological defeat that preceded the military collapse. German soldiers had been raised on the myth of German technical supremacy. They had been told that German engineering was the finest in the world, that German workers were the most skilled, that German weapons were unmatched. And in many individual cases, this was true. A Tiger tank was superior to a Sherman. A Panther could destroy 3 or 4 Shermans in a single engagement, but there were always 5 Shermans, always 6, always 10. The final year of the war, 1945, saw the complete disintegration of German armored capability. By January, German tank production had slowed to a trickle as Allied bombing and Soviet advances disrupted supply chains and destroyed factories. Meanwhile, American production continued unabated. The final drive into Germany featured tank densities that would have seemed fantastical in 1940. American armored divisions rolled east with hundreds of tanks per division, supported by thousands of trucks, backed by limitless supplies of fuel and ammunition. German forces, by contrast, were often immobilized for lack of fuel, their remaining tanks reduced to static pillboxes because there was no gasoline to move them. The statistics are stark and unforgiving. Over the course of the entire war, Germany produced approximately 67,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. This includes all variants, all models, all factories, all years. It represents the total output of German industry straining at maximum capacity. The United States produced approximately 88,000 tanks during its 3.5 years of direct participation. 88,000 tanks. More than Germany, more than Japan, which produced roughly 6,000 tanks during the war. More than Italy's 3,500. The United States alone outproduced the entire Axis alliance combined. And this figure does not include American production of tank destroyers, of which another 28,000 were built. It does not include self-propelled artillery. It does not count the thousands of armored vehicles supplied to allies. It is simply the number of tanks, 88,000 versus the Axis total, of approximately 76,500. But numbers alone cannot capture the profound ideological crisis this disparity represented for German military thought. The German army had gone to war believing in certain fundamental truths about conflict, that superior training and doctrine could overcome numerical disadvantages, that quality could triumph over quantity, that the fighting spirit of disciplined soldiers could compensate for material shortfalls. These beliefs were not foolish. They were rooted in German military history, in the victories of Frederick the Great, in the successes of the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. But they were beliefs suited to a different kind of war. They were beliefs that assumed resource parity, or at least resource proximity. They were utterly inadequate when facing an opponent who could lose 5 tanks for every one of yours and still have more tanks tomorrow than you had yesterday. The transformation in German military thinking was gradual, but inexorable. In 1942, captured German documents and interrogation reports show confidence. American production is exaggerated. American equipment is inferior. American soldiers lack the martial virtue necessary for sustained combat. By 1943, the tone shifts to concern. American production is substantial, but Germany can still compete through superior technology and tactics. By 1944, the reports reflect barely concealed desperation. American material superiority is overwhelming. German forces are fighting delaying actions. Victory is no longer discussed, except as propaganda. By 1945, there is only exhaustion and the mathematics of defeat. Franz Becker, if he survived Stalingrad, and statistically he probably did not, would have learned these lessons in the most visceral way possible. He would have watched German panzer units grind to a halt for lack of replacement vehicles, while Soviet armor, much of it supplied by American Lend-Lease, continued to press forward. He would have heard stories from soldiers transferred from the Western Front about the endless waves of American Shermans. He would have come to understand, perhaps dimly, perhaps with terrible clarity, that Germany had never stood a chance, not against the Soviet Union's vast reserves of manpower, not against Britain's stubborn resistance, and certainly not against America's industrial colossus. The factories that produced this industrial miracle were themselves symbols of American ideology. They were not state-run enterprises managed by party bureaucrats. They were private companies, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, that had been converted to war production but retained their corporate structures and management systems. The workers who built the tanks were not conscripts or slaves. They were paid wages, protected by unions, motivated by patriotism and profit. The system was chaotic, inefficient in many ways, marked by labor disputes and cost overruns and the messy compromises inherent in democratic capitalism, but it worked. worked at a scale that authoritarian systems could not match. Germany tried to squeeze more production from its factories through longer hours, through coerced labor, through ruthless exploitation of occupied territories. It never came close to American output. The Soviet Union, with its command economy and vast population, produced roughly 105,000 tanks during the war, more than America, though of simpler design and with significant American aid in raw materials and production equipment. But the Axis powers collectively could not match the combined production of the democracies. This was the great lesson of industrial warfare, the lesson that German military planners had failed to learn. Modern war is not won primarily on the battlefield. It is won in the factories. It is won by the nation that can produce more trucks, more tanks, more aircraft, more ships, more of everything than the enemy can destroy. The romanticism of warfare, the notion of heroic soldiers engaging in noble combat, was obliterated by the reality of production statistics. Courage matters, training matters, tactics matter. But in a war of attrition between industrialized nations, production capacity matters more. The German military had entered the war with tanks that were, in 1939, superior to most of their opponents. They had tactical doctrine that was revolutionary and effective. They had soldiers who were brave, disciplined, well-trained. They lost because they could not produce enough tanks to sustain multi-front warfare against enemies with greater industrial capacity. It is that simple. It is that brutal. The finest tank in the world is useless if you only have 10 of them and your enemy has 100 adequate tanks. The best trained crew cannot compensate for being outnumbered 5-1. German military thought had no answer to this problem because German military thought had been forged in an era when wars were shorter, resources more limited, and industrial capacity less decisive. American abundance became, in the final analysis, a weapon more devastating than any single piece of technology. It was not just the tanks themselves, but what they represented, the bottomless well of American productivity, the sense that no matter how many you destroyed, more would come. This psychological dimension of material superiority cannot be quantified in production statistics, but it permeates German accounts of the later war years. The despair in frontline reports, the resignation in captured soldier testimonies, the bitterness in memoirs written after the war, all reflect the realization that Germany was not defeated by superior soldiers or better tactics or crushing battlefield defeats. Germany was defeated by arithmetic, by the simple, terrible fact that America could build more tanks than Germany could destroy. The symbolism comes full circle in the ruins of German cities in the spring of 1945. American tanks, Shermans primarily, along with tank destroyers and self-propelled guns rolled through streets where German civilians emerged from cellars to witness the occupation. These civilians had been told for years that German industry was the finest in the world, that German weapons were unmatched, that victory was inevitable, because German technology and German fighting spirit would prevail. They had endured years of rationing, of strategic bombing, of privation justified by the promise of ultimate victory. And now they watched American tanks parade past, not one or two, but dozens, hundreds, endless columns of armor that seemed to mock every sacrifice, every propaganda claim, every promise of German superiority. The tanks were not just military vehicles, they were proof that Germany had been living in a fantasy, that the rhetoric of racial superiority and martial virtue and technical excellence was hollow when confronted with the industrial power of a democratic, capitalist, heterogeneous society that Germans had been taught to despise. Every Sherman that rolled past was a refutation of Nazi ideology, a steel and chrome argument that free societies could outproduce, outfight, and outlast dictatorships. The Germans had believed they were fighting a race of weaklings. Instead, they had awakened a giant whose productive capacity was so enormous that it could fight wars simultaneously in Europe and the Pacific while still improving the standard of living for workers at home. In the final reckoning, the war was decided before many of the famous battles were fought. It was decided in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and Gary, Indiana. It was decided by workers whose names are lost to history, men and women who welded steel and assembled engines and built tanks that would cross oceans to liberate continents. It was decided by an economic system that, for all its flaws and inequities, could mobilize resources and coordinate production at a scale that the world had never seen. The German military was defeated not by superior soldiers, though American soldiers learned and adapted and fought with increasing effectiveness, but by the simple fact that America could field 5 divisions for every German division, 10 tanks for every German tank, 100 aircraft for every German aircraft. Franz Becker's photograph, if it survived, would be a tiny fragment of this vast story. One young man, freezing in Russia, clutching a memory of home, wondering why the reinforcements never came. The reinforcements never came because they were never built. They were never built because Germany could not build them. Germany could not build them because German industry, despite its vaunted reputation, was operating at a fraction of American capacity. The photograph of a family in Munich, held by frost-blackened fingers in the ruins of Stalingrad, is as much a symbol of German defeat as any battlefield catastrophe. It represents the gap between propaganda and reality, between what Germans believed about their own strength and what the numbers revealed. The tanks kept rolling off American assembly lines long after Germany surrendered. They rolled through occupied Germany. They were shipped to the Pacific Theater, where they contributed to the final defeat of Japan. They were stored in depots, sold to Allied nations, eventually scrapped or preserved in museums. And in those museums, decades later, visitors would walk past Sherman tanks and read plaques describing their specifications, their deployment, their role in the war. The numbers would be listed: 49,234 Shermans produced. More than any other tank model in history, those numbers are sterile, factual, devoid of the sound and fury of war. But they tell the story completely. They tell the story of industrial power so overwhelming that it reshaped warfare itself. They tell the story of abundance as a weapon, of production as strategy, of factories as the ultimate battlefield. Epilogue. There is a photograph in the United States National Archives, taken in May 1945, of a Sherman tank parked in the ruins of Berlin. The tank bears the scars of combat: dented armor, a patched hole in the glacis plate, graffiti chalked on the turret by its crew. Behind it, the skeletal remains of the Reichstag smolder against a gray sky. The photograph is notable not for any dramatic action it captures, but for its mundane ordinariness. This is one tank among thousands. This is one victory among innumerable victories. This is the visual representation of what happens when unlimited industrial capacity meets finite military resistance. The Germans had never understood what they were facing. How could they? Understanding would have required abandoning core assumptions about the nature of power, about the relationship between military strength and industrial output, about the capacity of democratic societies to mobilize for total war. German military thought was sophisticated in many ways, but it was rooted in European experience, in wars of limited scope and duration. It had no conceptual framework for understanding a nation that could lose more tanks in a single week than Germany produced in a month, and still emerge from the battle stronger than before. The lesson, if there is a singular lesson, is this: modern industrial war is not romantic. It is not heroic in the traditional sense. It is mathematical. It is the reduction of human conflict to production statistics, replacement rates, logistical capacity. The side that can produce more, transport more, sustain more, will prevail. Courage matters, but courage is a constant, Every nation has brave soldiers. Every army can point to acts of heroism. What separated the Allies from the Axis was not courage, but capacity. The industrial capacity to turn raw materials into finished weapons at a rate that the enemy could not match. American abundance, symbolized by those endless columns of Sherman tanks, represented more than military power. It represented a different vision of society, a vision where prosperity was not reserved for elites, where production was democratized, where the wealth of a nation could be mobilized not through coercion, but through wage labor and market incentives. The tanks were built by workers who went home to their own houses, who bought groceries in stores full of food, who lived lives that would have seemed fantastically prosperous to European standards. The system was flawed, certainly. American democracy in the 1940s was marred by racial segregation, economic inequality, the internment of Japanese Americans. But it was a system that could produce 88,000 tanks while also improving material conditions for workers, a system that could fight a two-front global war while civilian consumption actually increased. The Germans had sneered at American softness, at American decadence, at the mongrel democracy they saw as weak and corrupt. They were wrong. Not because American society was perfect, but because they had mistaken openness for weakness, prosperity for softness, democracy for inefficiency. The very things they mocked, the labor unions, the profit motive, the chaotic pluralism of American life, turned out to be sources of strength. The factories that built the Sherman tanks were not manned by conscripts or slaves. They were manned by workers who had a stake in the outcome, who were paid well, who could change jobs if conditions were poor, who had unions to represent their interests. This messy, inefficient, argumentative democratic capitalism outproduced German totalitarianism by a factor that still seems difficult to credit. Franz Becker's question, whispered into the winter wind at Stalingrad, "How did we lose the tanks?" has a simple answer that took decades for some Germans to fully comprehend. They lost the tanks because they never had enough tanks. They never had enough tanks because they could never produce enough tanks. They could never produce enough tanks because their economy was smaller, their industry less integrated, their workforce less productive than the nation they had chosen to fight. All the propaganda about racial superiority, all the rhetoric about German excellence, all the faith in technical sophistication could not change the basic arithmetic. In a war where tanks were the currency of victory, America was wealthy beyond measure, and Germany was bankrupt from the start. The Sherman tank, ordinary and ubiquitous, became the symbol of that truth. Not the best tank, not the most sophisticated, not the most powerful, simply the tank that existed in numbers too vast to overcome. 5 Shermans for every Panther, 10 Shermans for every Tiger, 100 Shermans for every German soldier who believed in the myths of German superiority. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough, overwhelmingly, mathematically, inexorably enough to grind the Wehrmacht into dust and roll through Berlin while fresh tanks still rolled off assembly lines an ocean away, ready for battles that would never need to be fought because the arithmetic had already decided the outcome.